Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk. I am Ciara Pitman, and I am a product specialist at Shimadzu Scientific Instruments. And today I'll be talking about an analytical quality by design, or AQbD approach to separating cannabinoid stereoisomers. So, what are we going to learn throughout this talk? By the end of this talk, we'll be able to look at the difference in cannabinoid separation between chiral and reverse phase stationary phases, learn the benefits of using AQbD principles for method development, and understand software techniques to help you separate overlapping peaks. So where did this all start? So more recently, with the decline in CBD sales, many hemp growers and sellers began to move towards variants of THC. So this include the big Delta 8. So Delta 8 is derived from CBD, and it has increased in popularity because it's not specified as part of the Farm Bill, which we'll get to in a second. And therefore, it's not considered illegal. It does not have the same hallucinogenic effects as Delta 9, but it also has some effect, and it is important to be able to accurately separate each of these analogs. Okay, so let's talk about the Hemp Farming Act. In 2014, the Farm Bill distinguished hemp from marijuana, but the interpretation of this law was vague and difficult. It was not until the Hemp Farming Act was signed into the law in December 2018 that the legalization of the cultivation and distribution of hemp was federally legalized. Now, how did the affect Controlled Substance Act and the implications of the cannabis law be enforced? Well, marijuana is still considered a Schedule I drug. However, it removes the plant cannabis sativa L from the CSA as long as the plant contains no more than 0.3% THC by dried weight. This is very important because as this was the first time that an actual value was placed on the psychoactive compound, which forced forensic labs to adapt to the changes. So how did they adapt? Well, there have been some legal loopholes. So the Hemp Farming Act specifies Delta 9 THC at 0.3%, so it has to be lower. Delta 8 THC is not mentioned in this bill. Most legal experts agree that Delta 8 THC is legal. Delta 8 THC and then later on Delta 10 occur naturally at minute amounts, and they are not considered synthetic. However, Delta 8 THC in commercial products is synthesized in an unnatural way. So how are scientists analyzing these? So the potency testing is one way how farmers can make sure that they don't have more than 0.3% of THC in their crop. So before, gas chromatography was actually used for potency testing. However, the heated injection port can convert all acid forms of THC to Delta 9 THC due to heat. However, this is not always 100%. A way that can alleviate this problem is using high-performance liquid chromatography, or HPLC, and this allows for full separation of the native and acid forms of the THC isomers. So, what is HPLC? Well, we found out that HPLC is the golden standard of potency testing. So, HPLC uses solvents and it is pulled through a pump. Then, from the pump, it goes to the injector. And this is where your mobile phase, so the solvents that you pulled, then interact with your sample. It then moves through your column where that is where the separation occurs. And then it can go to your detector. And so with HPLC, you can use numerous detectors, but the most common is usually UV vis, photodiode array, or even mass spec. And then after the detector, you have a nice, lovely chromatogram of your separated compounds. So let's take a look at the naturally occurring cannabinoids. So as you might know, the cannabinoid list is constantly growing. So these were the first 11 compounds that were of the most concern. So we have Delta 9 THC, Delta 8 THC, THCA, THCV, CBD, CBDA, CBN, CBDV, CBG, CBGA, and CBC. And the ones with the boxes were the most common. And so you see the Delta 9 and Delta 8 THC were one of our most popular and therefore also need the most separation. Another one of note is THCV, and this is because it's more psychotropic than the delta-9 THC. It's an appetite suppressant, and it actually can occur at very low abundance, which can be detected down to 0.1% of its dry weight. So what does this mean for our methods? So there is an 11 cannabinoid mixture separation. This happens on a reverse phase chromatography. And as you can see from the chromatogram, delta-9 and delta-8 THC can be separated, as well as the rest of the cannabinoids. So what happens if we want to use this in real-world techniques? Well, this can be applied to many different real-world techniques. This is an example of a flower sample and of an oil sample. The black is our overlay of our standard, so that 11 mix that we just saw, and the pink is our sample, so the flower and the oil. And as you can see, we were able to detect the different cannabinoids in both the flower sample and the oil sample. But as we know, the list is constantly growing. So to increase the amount of cannabinoids we can test, we added 10 more. So this includes delta-9 THCP, delta-8 THCA, CBDP, CBCO, CBCV, CBL, THCVA, CBCA, CBDVA, and CBT. So what does this mean for our chromatogram? Well, taking the same exact separation that we saw for our 11, we now have 21. This is also done on a reverse phase system. So nothing much has changed. Our gradient profile is the same. We're using a UV vis detector. The only thing that has changed is that our runtime is a little longer to account for the extended amount of cannabinoids. And if you look at our chromatogram, we still have good separation for all of the cannabinoids, including the delta-8 and the delta-9 isomers. So to even go further, there are many other isomers that we can look at. This is an example of delta-8, delta-9, and I mentioned earlier delta-10. But what if we look at different delta-10, delta-9, and delta-8 analogs? So if we look at it, we see a lot of different stereoisomers and chirality in these molecules. So what does that mean for our chromatography? Well, first, let's talk about chirality. So chirality does matter, and the way the molecules interact with the columns as well as the other also matter. This is just an example of chiral compounds and why chirality matters. So if we look at glucose, D-glucose and L-glucose, there's a difference in glucose as one makes you fat and the other one has no effect on you, as well as the different medications. So ibuprofen, the D is the anti-inflammatory, the L does nothing, and as well as the other medications. So chirality does matter, and therefore we do have to separate them. And one of the ways we do this is through chromatography. So let's look at the 4 compounds we had just mentioned. So the delta-6A, 10A THC isomers and the delta-10 THC isomer. If you look at our chromatogram, it doesn't look as separated as our 11 and 21 mix. And we're using the same method conditions as we did before. This is on a reverse phase stationary phase column. We're using the same gradient and the same mobile phases. So what does this mean? Can we not separate it? Or what should we do next in order to separate these 4 molecules? So this can be very overwhelming of where to start. Well, you can change the solvents to see if you can get separation. You can change out your columns and test different columns until you get your separation. And you can also change your gradients. But that's a lot of things to test one after the other. So is there a simpler way to do this? You can use a method scouting system. So with a method scouting system, if we're back to our HPLC diagram, you have a solvent, you have the injection, you have your column, and it goes to the detector. Well, with our method scouted system, it's kind of an expanded version of this. Instead of using just 2 or 4 different solvents, we can actually test up to 8 different solvents. So you can blend or mix 8 different solvents to see if that can help, separate your compounds. Okay, so we covered the solvent part. What about the columns? So instead of testing just one column at a time, we can actually set up 6 and even 12 different columns to test with those different solvents. And then it all goes to the detector to create a chromatogram. Okay, so when we go and we put in all of our columns, so we're using 6 different chiral columns, and we're only using 1 organic and 1 aqueous solvent. So we're only using 2 solvents. We actually have an output of each column has about 5 different outputs. And so that can be a data overload, which actually makes it very overwhelming to look at. So how can we make this easier on ourselves? Well, with the method scouting, in conjunction with analytical quality by design or AQbD principles, it actually makes it easier for the user to screen data, optimize it, and actually have a robust method afterwards. And it's all within a software. So what we saw just a slide ago was our screening phase. So this is where you select all your solvents and your columns that you think would be suitable. So before we even start with AQbD, we usually like to start with an analytical target profile. And so we saw that by using our 21 and our 11 method, that these solvents actually do separate our cannabinoids. So we do have our solvents. And then with our columns, we know that the reverse stationary phase doesn't work. So why not try a chiral column to separate our chiral isomers? So after the screening phase, you're going to have one good match between a solvent and a column. The software actually allows you to select your best method, so you don't have to go through all that data sorting to make sure which method is the best, which column is the best, and which solvent's the best. The best pair is actually given to you. Then you can move to your optimization phase. So your optimization phase is when we can start testing other parameters. This is like gradients, temperatures, flow rates, even like how long you want to hold a certain duration. And then with our optimization phase, again, the software allows you to look at all the different methods that you tested and select the most optimal. And what we'll see later on throughout the presentation, it actually has some fun tools to help you select this, such as predictive chromatograms, heat mapping, and 3D modeling. Once you've selected your ideal conditions through your optimization phase, we go to our robustness phase. And this is just to make sure that our method is actually robust and that we can use it to test all of our other screening and methods after this. Okay, so let's start with our 4 compound screening phase. So we talked about those 4 different stereoisomers and that we can't separate it on the reverse stationary phase. So testing with our 6 chiral columns, we see that A, U, and GU actually have the best outcome. And so if you look at this compared to the other 4, IHU was only able to give us 1 peak. So everything came out as 1. IBU, only 2, and IDU and ICU weren't able to separate all 4, like the IAU and the IGU. Now, why are we looking at IAU and IGU? Well, we're able to separate those 4, but let's take a closer look at these 2. Which is the best if they can both separate 4? This comes down to the retention time. So with IGU, it has a slightly better separation and a faster retention time. So that is ideal for our next step. So let's move into our optimization phase for these 4 compounds. Like I mentioned before, our optimization phase actually has some fun tools that allows us to select the best running conditions. So if we see in the middle here, we have our predictive chromatogram. So the software actually predicts that during these certain running conditions that you claim that are optimal, we see where they're going to elute and if they're going to overlap. With the heat mapping and the 3D modeling, this actually allows us to select our optimal conditions a little better. So with the heat mapping, the red area is the most ideal conditions, whereas the blue is the least ideal. We're able to actually pinpoint with software the most optimal condition, and then the box that you see is actually the robustness conditions. So this actually helps us to move to the next phase of the robustness testing to see in what area is our method the most robust. With the 3D modeling, we can look at three different conditions. So in this case, it's concentration, duration of the whole time, and then this is a minimum resolution. And so the 3D modeling actually gives you a visual of where is your top most ideal conditions. Okay. So we went through our screening, optimization, and then later we went through robustness for our separation of 4-compound mix. And as you can see, we were able to separate our 4-compound mix, and this was our method. So we used a photodiode array. That way, with this system, we were able to scan at different wavelengths. And so 221 nanometers was the ideal. Our mobile phase conditions was actually isocratic rather than the gradient we saw earlier on. And the separation was a 40A to a 60B. The ideal column that we saw throughout our testing of the 4 was the chiral pack IGU. Our flow rate was 0.8 mils per minute. Our runtime was only 15, but as you can see with our chromatogram here, we could actually reduce it a little bit further. Oven temperature was 40 and the injection volume was 5, which that did not change from the original 11 and 21 mix. So I keep mentioning the 11 and 21 mix. So now that we have separated our 4 very difficult stereoisomer compounds using chiral separation, what would happen if we added our previous separated 11 mix that we saw on a C18 or reverse phase? Let's see if this causes any problems separating the 4 from the 11. Okay, so let's start off at the top from our screening phase, the 15-component screening phase. As you can see, the IGU is the most preferred column again, and in this one, we can actually tell between the IGU and the IAU that the IGU does provide a better separation. As you can see, the components of this are a little more separated than that of the IAU, and definitely more separated than all of the other chiral columns. So let's take this to the optimization phase. So with our 15 component optimization and robustness, we first start with our 3D mapping. So as you can see with our 3D mapping, we're able to see a distinct optimal point. And so I'm showing you minimum resolution here with the flow rate as well as oven temperature. With our heat maps, we see a very narrowed down area that allows us to choose the most ideal conditions. And then later when we tested robustness, we see a robustness statistical output of our flow rate and our oven temperature that 1.1 flow rate and our 45 are our optimal conditions. And if we deviate outside of that, what we can see our method might get a little less robust, so it's better to stay within those running conditions. So this is our final separated 15 compound mix. Again, the detector that we used was a photodiode array, or PDA, 221 nanometers, isocratic separation, but Since we have added a couple more cannabinoids, the separation has changed a little bit. It's now a 54A, 46B. The column stayed the same. We increased our flow rate to 1.1 mils per minute. The runtime also increased since we added 11 more different compounds. So it is about a 30-minute runtime. The oven temperature is about 45, and the injection volume stayed the same at 5 microliters. All right, so we talked about the 11, and originally we also talked about the 21. So let's see if we can also put our 4 with our 21 to create a 25 compound separation. So going through that screening phase originally, we saw the IGU worked for both the 4 and our 15. And with the screening phase of this, I didn't want to put all of the graphs up here to overwhelm you, but the IGU was also the best to separate the 25 cannabinoids. This is the optimization of our 25 cannabinoids. And as you can see, the evaluation value, so the overall best running conditions, the separated peak count, and minimum resolution heat maps are shown here. In that square there that you see under the evaluation value, that is our ideal running conditions and our area of robustness. So this is the final chromatogram of our 25 compound mix. Again, the detector, the PDA at 221, an isocratic separation, and it has changed just slightly from our 15 mix. We're at a 56A44B with the same column of the chiral pack IGU. And then we had a slight increase in our flow rate, so 1.3 mils per minute, and also an increase in our runtime, so 50 minutes for this entire separation of 25 compounds. The oven temperature, it was at 38, and the injection volume was still at 5 milliliters. So with this, there's more optimization that can be done. We can play around with gradients a little bit more to see if we can get a better separation or even to decrease runtime. But that is a future work situation. What I do want to point out is our last learning objective of what if we can't get everything to separate? Some things just may not separate. And what if you want to use just a UV vis or PDA versus something more advanced like a mass spec? Well, let's take a closer look at these colluting or shouldering peaks. Okay. So this is an example of our 2 compounds of our 25 mix that are actually colluting. With peak deconvolution, we can actually use multivariate curve resolution, alternating least squares, or to save your breath, MCR-ALS. And so this is a math-based algorithm that actually allows you to detect colluting peaks, as well as it can be used for impurities. So as you can see here, that with our peak deconvolution, we're able to tell where one peak starts and another peak ends, or the other peak starts. So our overlapping have actually been broken down to 2 different peaks. So if you are still having problems with, separation, this is a very handy tool that can be used to deconvolute peaks to see if, there's just one peak with a shoulder, if there's a couple peaks, or if you even want to use it for impurities. So finally, we've made it through all of our learning objectives. So let's to observe the difference in cannabinoid separation between chiral and reverse phase stationary phases. Okay, so we saw that THC isomers can be difficult to separate on just reverse phase conditions due to their chirality. So kind of alleviating this problem, we use chiral columns, and that solved the problem mostly for colluting. Our second objective was to learn benefits of AQbD principles for method development. So AQbD can the tedious task of testing, analyzing, and comparing individual runs. And we saw this where, We used our method scouting system to help us have an high throughput screening and everything, but analyzing all that data can be overwhelming. But using AQbD principles as well as assisted software actually alleviates all of that for you and allows you to have the most optimal run. Lastly, we briefly saw and understood software techniques to separate overlapping peaks. So with peak deconvolution, this can aid in identifying co-eluting peaks and impurities of the sample, and this can help you look at co-eluting as well as the small little impurities to see if there's 1, 2, or maybe 3 or 4 peaks. And so I would like to thank you for joining this talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask. Thank you.